I am Lance Foster, Mineraye Lance Foster, and I am a member of the Iowa tribe, Bachoche people. Means gray snow, a lot of meanings to it. So I thought maybe I'm going to talk a little bit about the Iowa tribe in Iowa and just kind of give you guys kind of an overview of that. The Iowa people, of course, lived out throughout Iowa up until just before the coming of the white people. By the time American settlers arrived this area, it was mostly occupied on the eastern part of the state by the Dakota and the Sac and Fox, or Sac and Meskwaki. But we had been here for a long time before that. Before contact with the white people, our legends speak of our clans coming from different places, with the Bear Clan and the Wolf Clan, Elk, Buffalo, Thunder Clan, and meeting each other and then forming a great nation in one place. Kind of that formation of that nation was a place called Red Banks, and most identify that as being on Lake Michigan. Of course, we inhabited all this land here, but later on, the settlers drew state lines over these places and then called them different states. The latest evidence indicates our origins were in woodland societies in Iowa and Wisconsin about 1,000 years ago, about 1,000 AD, such as effigy mounds. Archaeological sites are recognized as the Oneota culture from about AD 1000 to about 1700 in Iowa. And I think they're at Living History Farms. That's about the time period where the recreated village is, about 1700. And we were all about 9 surrounding states, Iowa being kind of the central heartland for our people. Other locations that have our presence are the Pipestone Quarry in Minnesota and the Leary site in Nebraska. Our closest traditions and our language seems to be that we were one people with the Ho-Chunk or Winnebago people, the Otoe, Missouri people. Some say also the Omaha and Ponca. And then we would begin to split over those couple hundred years between 1200 to 1500 AD. Our first contact with non-Indians, with white people, were with the French in the 1680s. And that's where the maps start documenting our presence in Iowa. We were about maybe 5,000 of us when there was first contact, but population had been in decline even before then. There were epidemics and intertribal wars, and those kind of moved us to the south and the west along the Missouri River, kind of receding from those lands in eastern Iowa and southern Minnesota by the early 1700s. And you know, the Americans didn't really get into Iowa until about 100 years later with the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis and Clark and others did notice our presence around Council Bluffs by about 1804. And the largest village of our people is a site called Iowaville on lower Des Moines River. And we lived there almost until the early 1800s there as well. We had different bands that lived in different places. And then after the War of 1812, we began a series of treaties ceding lands to the United States in the 1820s and 1830s. The lands in Iowa, for the most part, got ceded to the U.S. in 1837 and 1838. You guys may know about the Indian removal, like the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee and all that, kind of pushing the Manifest Destiny that pushed most of the tribes out of the eastern United States. In the 1830s, it became an official policy. And in 1836, we were relocated from Northwest Missouri to the present reservation here in northeast Kansas and southeast Nebraska. And several forced cessions shrank our reservation to the present size by 1861. One thing about, there's a huge spectrum of understanding out there about Indian people. You have all the way from people who aren't familiar with Indians at all and expect Indians to be riding around on horseback, chasing buffalo, living in teepees and wearing eagle feathers and talking an Indian language. And remember, there is no Indian language any more than there is a white people language. Some of the native languages were as different from each other as Chinese is from English. Very different. The spectrum of Indian languages, I mean, huge differences. So I think it's important to know that once people are on reservations, we didn't cease to exist. Now, we did face a lot of population shrinkage because of epidemics and such. Tribes intermarried with each other, and you have to know that, especially by this time, but it also happened before contact, that tribal identity is more of almost a political status. So the treaties with the United States and tribes is based upon that sovereignty as distinct political units of people, nations, and that's why we call ourselves nations. So, our kinship patterns depends on the kind of tribe, which tribe. Some tribes go by clans, and that's what ours do, some by bands. But families are the core identity of who you are, and whether you trace your father, your mother, or both sides or whatever. So with the Ioway people, for example, I'm Bear Clan, Mato Kiraji. And in many ways, Bear people would find our closer relations among, say, the Meskwaki Bear people. And even though we're totally different languages, totally different identities nationally, the clan is kind of the core of who you are. Your identity that way, your religious identity, spiritual, kinship, all that. And then the nation you're part of is like I said, it's the language to some extent, but it's very political. It's kind of like if you think about an American who goes over to France and marries a French person, and then their child is born in France, even though that kid is American too, half American, they wouldn't be considered an American citizen because they weren't born in America. That's the political status part of it. Let me jump to where we are. So we were put on a reservation here in northeast Kansas, southeast Nebraska. If you draw a line from between Kansas and Nebraska, which was drawn across us as part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, where it touches the Missouri, that's where we're located today. And the reservation was forced to shrink from 256,000 acres to 12,000 acres by 1861, the beginning of the Civil War. And that's why we have this really weird name, the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. We're the Iowa tribe, and the state of Iowa was named for us. Now, I'll tell you in a minute how that came to be. But so we've got a reservation here in Indian country or Indian territory, depending on how you want to look at it. And 1836, we're there. 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act draws that line right across our reservation. And therefore, now the Iowa tribe is in Kansas and in Nebraska. So we're called the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. So the name of Iowa, I'm trying to think of things that you folks probably would be interested in being from Iowa and in Iowa. And there's a lot of mythology about where that word came from. This is the place, the land between two rivers, etc. And again, remember, I told you there's no such thing as an Indian language. And it doesn't mean that in any Indian language, either the Siouan languages or the Algonquian languages. So I think people probably heard a name and then said, oh, I think those Indians meant this and that. So people that didn't speak the languages. But really, Iowa, the term as applied to our nation, likely the best way we can figure it out has to do with how we did adoption process with different tribes and kind of symbolically rocking them back and forth like they're being adopted into our family as an infant. It means sleepy ones, like when you're going to sleep. But the state of Iowa, I think it was Lieutenant Pike. Was it Lieutenant Pike? Oh no, it was what's that town in Minnesota, just north of the boundary? I wish I could hear you guys, but I can't. Anyway, he was exploring the land on this side when it was part of the Wisconsin territory, and he went up what he called the Iowa River, and it was called the Iowa River because it was the river of the Iowas, is where the Iowas lived. And he said the Iowa country, and from that they call it the Iowa territory, and then it became the Iowa state of Iowa. So that's the process that Iowa was named. So in our tribe way back over here in Kansas and Nebraska, almost all our people fought on the side of the North in the Civil War. And then after the war, due to land pressures by continuing expansion by settlers and destruction of our game for meat markets and stuff down in St. Louis, about half of our tribe pulled up stakes from here and then moved down to Oklahoma. Well, what's now Oklahoma? Back then it wasn't Oklahoma yet. And then in 1887 to 1892, there was a process called general allotment. And allotment of land divided up the reservations because it used to be the Indians lived in common on those small pieces of land, and you could have a village and then you would like go and eat. It was very a communal life way, but that wasn't getting us assimilated. There are two processes: acculturation, when you gain, like when you start using metal pots instead of pottery, when you start using English instead of Ioway, when you start using guns instead of bows and arrows. That's called acculturation, when you're taking on another culture. But assimilation is when you actually begin to disappear as a people and get absorbed into the general population, and you don't have your own identity anymore, which was the ultimate goal of the United States government. They had three choices what to do with the Indians who were in their way of the expansion of their nation. And one is just to wipe us out through genocide, wars, whatever. One was to keep pushing us before them like a bulldozer. And after a while, there's only so far you can push people. It's all taken up by settlements. Or the other way is to say, okay, let's make these Indians into white people. And so as I said in the beginning of my talk, and you got people who don't know much about Indians and they expect Indians to be riding around horses and stuff. And if they're not doing that and they don't have the long braids and stuff, then they're not really Indians in their eyes. And that just comes from not understanding and not being familiar with any Indians in their own lives. And the Indians, even lighter than me, Indians are red-haired and freckled. So Indian identity continues on in whatever way it can in the descendants of these folks. Some speak the language and some don't, but you kind of hold on to what you can. So after allotment, and allotment, like I said, divided it up. The ultimate goal was for people to be individual landowners instead of living in common. And then that means within 25 years, you had to start paying taxes on your land. It turned into fee simple status. And in that way, if you didn't understand business and taxes and stuff, you lost your land. And then you had white people who just wanted to find interesting ways to acquire land. So they'd get somebody drunk or get somebody who owed them some money and put a lien on their property or whatever. So by the 1930s, about 90% of our reservation had been lost to those kind of practices. And so that was kind of our low point, I would say. The boarding schools had taken away most of our language use, if not all. No, not all, but most of it. And most of us dressed just like white people. Some were still dark, and some had been married into blonde, blue-eyed people, and so they got lighter and lighter. So Indian isn't just a matter of degree of blood, what's called blood quantum. It is a legal status as an independent nation, a sovereign nation. And it is a matter of the community recognizes you as being one of the people, knowing your relatives and knowing who you came from, all that. So you probably all have been hearing also in the news about the boarding schools. The early boarding schools, it always was the goal for assimilation, to absorb us into the general population. But boarding schools was a way to divide the kids, take the kids away from their parents. The first phase was kind of to teach them the Bible and learn their language by translation stuff into the Bible, and then teach them how to be blacksmiths and learn how to keep house and stuff like that. And then the next phase after that was to take them totally away from their family. At least here on the reservation, when we had a little school here, they could keep an eye on the kids and take the kids out of school if things weren't right. But once they moved into places like Carlisle or Genoa, which is up in Nebraska, take them away from it. And once the federal people and the churches really started getting their hooks into it, they said they outlawed any speaking of the language. They cut people's hair. They were abusive. A lot of kids who were disappeared. And so that was ongoing. On our reservation here, one of the challenges we faced was the Oregon-California Trail went right through our reservation. And a lot of people got cholera and died off. There was a lot of drinking. People got killed. It was a really hard time. One of the stories I can tell you is of a little girl who was about 3 years old, who was captured by a white family that was moving to Oregon in a wagon. They wanted a little playmate for their little girl. So they took this little Indian girl. They figured, hey, Indians are like animals. They can just kind of grab them and take them. So they kidnapped her and took her back to Oregon. And until later in her late teens, she kind of left there to try to find her way back here. And I don't want to think about the things that she had to do as a young Indian girl by herself, trying to work her way across territory that was settled by that time. But by the time she got here, she didn't know what her Indian name was anymore. She was only 3 when she had been captured. They didn't tell her what her Indian name was, if she even told them when she was that little. She could only speak English by that time. So she wandered around asking everybody who she was. And her family had actually been one of the ones died from cholera. And so she traveled around. She kind of went mental, kind of lost her mind. And she was wandering over in St. Joe across the river here, asking everybody who she was and if they knew what her name was. And she got older and older until she finally ended up in one of those state farms that they put homeless people in back then. And they say they still see her spirit over there wandering around asking people who she is. So those are some of the human stories that we know about. The things that it's not about Indians riding around horseback chasing buffaloes or having big fights with Custer, but that's the more regular kind of experience more tribes had here in the Midwest, especially, and even elsewhere. It's kind of a slow unfolding tragedy, trying to hold on to who you are to some extent anyway. So the allotment of land to various individuals, like I said, 90% of it had been lost by the 1930s. There was a low point of language and culture. There's a lot of extensive intermarriage with settlers. That's part of the reason I'm so pale, is the settlers always want that land and they're marrying who they can to get that land. And in the New Deal, FDR, after the Great Depression, they started a bunch of programs like the WPA and everything. There was one called the Indian Reorganization Act. And up to that point, agents had kind of run the tribes almost like as the petty lords, little kingdoms of their own, telling what people could and couldn't do. And only in 1924, Indians made citizens. I mean, there had been individuals who had been citizens before that. By 1924, they kind of closed all the loopholes and made Indians finally citizens here in America. But the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 tried to make Indian people so we could kind of control our own lives again, develop our own tribal governments. Some tribes had their own governments, and it was kind of forced upon them. And other tribes, for our tribe, for example, it was an opportunity. So we got our first constitution, we got our first tribal council, we got our tribal roll that all our descendants are traced through those original people in 1937 that were placed on the tribal roll. And that was a big change. Started being able to get at least some limited self-determination again, limited choices. This building I'm in here now, it looks, it's a stone building, but that was built by our people as a community center back in 1939. Of course, World War II changed things. And because there was really limited land here and there weren't any jobs, people, went to the service. Of all the ethnic groups in America, Native Americans are recorded as having the highest service levels for their group to serve in the armed forces. It's part of a tradition. And then after having that experience, a lot of people, when they came home, there weren't any jobs and everything, so they scattered out, lived in places like Omaha, Kansas City, and started trying to make families there and find jobs there and work in factories and things like that. Get better opportunities far away, which means that we've got about 4,500 people on the rolls. Some only about maybe 10% of those people live on the reservation or around the reservation. So 90% of us live elsewhere because of that scattering. Then there's a long period of struggle and then slow rebuilding from 1940s through the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we started having another era in our history called self-determination. And that is, again, there were federal programs, part of the war on poverty, whether it was the Appalachians or urban America, in urban places, white, Black, Indian. And those were federal programs for the civil rights and the war on poverty, because there were a lot of people that were being held back and health was bad. So 1970s to the 1990s were a lot of those programs, and it was a real period of growth. We got our administration building built here and everything. And then part of the Indian Gaming Act in the 1990s, we first had a little bingo place here. And now we have a small rural casino called Casino White Cloud. And that provided jobs for people who were here. And that was the primary thing. Now, some people think Indians get free money. Some tribes get per capita payments, but we don't. We don't distribute per capita to our members. We mainly use it for land, for buy back some of our land, to keep those jobs going, to get roads and stuff like that, programs that we can't find money any other way, because we're a pretty rural area. Let me tell you, this is one of the opportunities too to tell you something interesting about Indian people. People think Indians gets free stuff. I mean, who doesn't like free stuff? You can get it, whatever you are, Indian, white, Black, whatever. Everybody likes free stuff. But the reality is, part of that Indian Reorganization Act that we had, the model was like a U.S. corporation. That's why we don't have chiefs and things like that. We have there's a chairman, a vice chairman. That's what I've been for a couple of years now through the pandemic. A treasurer and a secretary. And then we also have a member. And so that's essentially like a business committee. It's sort of like a corporate board is what it is. And so our constitutions are kind of a blend of a corporation charter and a constitution. So just like with any kind of thing, when you're a shareholder, and you can think of it in a way, tribal members as shareholders, some tribes do share, if the tribe did well in terms of a business, they will get percentages for per capita payments. We don't do that. We don't have that kind of situation here, but some do that. So if you get mad at Indians getting per capita payments, might as well get mad at IBM distributing shareholder shares. It's the same principle. If you do well, they get some money. If you don't do well, if they don't, the shareholders. Second thing is people sometimes get money or help based upon poverty level, whether you're Indian, black, white, whatever. If you're under a certain federal poverty level, which is for, I think it's around 17,000 something this year. If you make under that, then you get access to things like SNAP or commodities or food or help with rent, or not usually help with rent as much as Section 8 housing, things like that, lowered rent control. So that goes without saying. It's not just Indian people, it's anybody who doesn't make $17,000 a year or whatever the adjustment is if you have a larger family, et cetera. And then the third kind of thing that people sometimes get stuff would be, I think it's kind of when anybody gets any free stuff, when, for example, there might be a business that is distributing food in the community, not just here, but anywhere, just as kind of a charity thing to do. And that's about the only free things that people get, or Indians getting free money and all that, getting free stuff. Oh, and then of course, sometimes with treaties, there are recognitions that Indians retain hunting rights or fishing rights, or sometimes there's agreement for education to get pre-education in some cases. Usually those are those boarding schools. But that's all that Indians get stuff kind of thing that people seem to have in their brains all the time. Now, here's some changes, other things that have been going on probably since the 1990s, besides the casinos and stuff. So like everywhere else, and you see it in Iowa, those small diversified agricultural family farms changed more and more from family farms to industrial agriculture. Lands were consolidated from having a few hogs and a cow and all that to big business, corn, soybeans, all that kind of thing. And then the damage to the land was becoming more and more noticeable, with inputs costing so much and machinery being millions of dollars. And it just became a larger part of the world economic system as it is, right? The markets, the volatility, the small size of land holding made it difficult for standard farming on the acreage available. And so one of the things that happened to us over the last 5 years or so, 5, 6, 7 years, is unlike some people who can keep adding to their operations if they have the money, or things aren't working out, or the kids don't want to keep farming, you can always sell out, you can move, you can do whatever you need to do. Well, we're kind of frozen in time here. We're kind of frozen into a situation, good and bad, that we've been here for over 1836, 1936, almost 200 years. And this is the only place for us. It's the only place that we have. It's the only place we guaranteed to have. We're going to be here for another 1,000 years unless the world changes radically, which they say it's going to, but we'll see. But we only know about this place as our home. And that's part of the reason we didn't move to Oklahoma, the group that stayed here. So we know our practices are different than getting whatever we can out of the land. We have to try to do regenerative agriculture here because we see the soil's health is suffering and declining. So we've tried several new directions since about 2016, and it's based on regenerative farming, things like honeybees, paddock grazing for cattle, cover crops, range-fed chickens. We even started hemp last year, industrial hemp. We're not, the THC of the marijuana type stuff isn't legal here. But we have a lot of products that we started trying to develop here for people to have jobs here. Then there were floods in 2018, and now the pandemic of 2020 have compelled a lot of changes that we're struggling with. We've got a tribal election in about a week, which always causes, like any election anywhere, a lot of drama. But those of us in here now who understand what's happening to the land are really have a long vision and a commitment to those regenerative practices and new economic initiatives. So I did want to mention probably the most significant thing in my little kind of sphere that I've been working with. We were supposed to talk a little bit about last night, but the technology wasn't cooperative. So in 2020, during the pandemic, we had a couple of conservation kind of chunks of land we had to take care of a specific way. We had made agreements with. One was the Leary Site National Historic Landmark, which is an ancestral village site here that our ancestors lived in 1200 to 1400. And we traded with the ancestral Arikara and Pawnee, probably the Skiddy Pawnee. It's had national significance since 1965. It is probably the third in size. If Cahokia was New York and Blood Run or Good Earth was Chicago, this is kind of like Kansas City, right? So several thousand people lived here. And then also there was another tract, the Nature Conservancy owned the Rula Bluffs Preserve and designated by Nebraska as a biologically unique landscape and has several threatened species of plants and animals. And they decided to transfer it back to the tribe, and it did so in two tracts, in the first in 2018. And then the second tract in 2020, well, 2019 is when that actually happened. There were a lot of conservation easements, and we had to agree to strict requirements. Now, our people, just like most people here and in rural places everywhere, immediately are worried about conservation areas, so if they can't hunt or chop trees or whatever right around their ATVs or whatever. But these are restrictions we had on the deeds. So thinking quickly, it became kind of my brainchild. I realized that the idea of a national park helps people understand that this is conservation land. It is people understand when you say national park, but of course, usually you have to go through the Congress and all that. The good thing about tribal sovereignty is that tribes can do a lot of things. We're nations, and we can do things like that on our own. And so I looked for another model, and the Red Cliff Ojibwe up at Frog Bay had already declared one. It's a little smaller than ours is, but declared a tribal national park. So we declared Ioway Tribal National Park in 2020, and we have a couple other tracts. We added another one that includes the monument. Now you guys probably know your history. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is kind of led to the Civil War. The idea that Kansas was going to have popular sovereignty, and they had people from the north moving here trying to block the expansion of slavery, and people from Missouri came over to try to continue the spread of slavery. So they had the idea of bleeding Kansas, right? So the Kansas-Nebraska Act kind of sparked that off, and that is right here on our reservation, that monument that was a precursor to the Civil War. So having these two tracts, the Rula Bluffs and the Leary National Historic Landmark, as well as this, the Kansas-Nebraska Act monument, and some other recreational areas along the bluffs, we thought we would establish that to help our people reconnect with the land in a different way, to begin to learn the conservation practices, the plants. Like I said, most of us don't live on the reservation. They live in like California or Texas or New York. When you come back, there's really no place to visit or learn about your culture much. So that's part of what this is. And that's what's important to know about Ioway Tribal National Park, is that it is not part of the usual the National Park Service. It's not like Yellowstone. It is a natural area, cultural and natural parts to it. And it connects to our people, first of all, to help people reconnect with their land and culture. And then secondarily, we aim to open it about 2025. There will be opportunities for non-tribal members to come and kind of experience and learn about our culture and our land, starting in about 2025. So there's that. And let's see, total is about 564 acres. But this last Monday, we had the governor of Kansas sign over about a nine acre tract to us with one of our missions boarding schools on it. And I'm going to do some of the work on Tuesday, some of the paperwork needed. And that will be really another exciting part of that story, telling about the trail, telling about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and things like that. So really the goal is to tell our tribe's story, protect our lands, provide job and economic health, and then work with the communities for the betterment of all. I know this is about 15 minutes I think I have left. I don't know if Jim or Stacy or somebody would like maybe to field some questions in a minute, but I will tell you where you can learn some more about our history and stuff. So the first one really probably would be the Ioway Indians. Let me see if I can get that. Oh, geez, what the heck? Let me see if I can turn off that background. And can I turn off my background? Virtual background, none. Okay. See, this is the beautiful place I'm actually in. So the Iowa Indians and Martha Royce Blaine is kind of the standard work to start with. Tells almost all the story there. There is another nice one called Iowa Life by Greg Olson that talks more about the reservation era, the beginning of it. And Iowa and Missouri is another one. Some of you may know me best from Indians of Iowa. I wrote this book, and it tells not only about Iowa people, but the Dakota, Meskwaki, Potawatomi, all the folks. Get at least an intro to those folks that I have through the University of Iowa Press. And also from the University of Iowa Press is Lynn Alex's Iowa's Archaeological Past. I did that image when I was attending school in Ames at Iowa State University. And it tells not only about the tribes, it tells about archaeology. And the last two books I'd like to tell you it's worth watching are not just about Iowa, but just generally. There's the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, which gives you probably the best overview from an Indian perspective. And here's one that's one of my favorites. If you're only going to get one to kind of clear your head of some of the mythology out there about Indians, I think this is the one I would recommend by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And it's like all the real Indians died off and 20 other myths about Native Americans. And what's kind of cool about it, it has things like, oh, Columbus discovered America, and Indians were the first immigrants to the Western Hemisphere, and Indians should move on, forget the past, and the United States didn't have a policy of genocide. The United States gave Indians their reservations. Sports mascots honor Native Americans. Casinos make them all rich, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, if you want something to really kind of break over your head and get out of the mindset about Indian people that you really may just want to discover something new, I would recommend this book. Those are some of the books that I would recommend. And I will send a list to Jim. So in case there's somebody that didn't have time to write it down or whatever, you will have that time. So maybe the next 10 minutes or so, Jim, if you want to open up the mic or if you can pass on some questions that somebody else might have about either the Ioways or Indians in general, I'll do my best to answer until, I guess we have until noon. Well, that's always a tricky thing. Our last native speakers, fully fluent, passed away in like 96, 97. The rest of us know it to some extent, but we're not fully fluent. And by that, I mean, the way I define it is people who can talk only in their own language and say everything they want to say and do that all day long without breaking into English. That's why we call fluency. We don't have any fluency. So what we do is we declared a 10-year resolution to commit to bringing back the language as much as possible. I'm one of the few who speak it to some extent. And so the trouble is that people who haven't studied languages think it's a matter of like attending a couple classes and magically you speak, but there's a range, right? There's a range of people who want to say, well, I want to say something in Indian, and then they want to know a couple words maybe, or say, how's your day? And that's good. It's just more about curiosity or something. Then there's people who want to actually have conversations. That takes more work because you have to learn how to conjugate and do grammar and all that stuff. And I found not a lot of people have that kind of patience to do that. But you got to do what you can do to keep it going. And so we are, part of our language will be embedded in the experience for people who go to the tribal national park. And that's probably going to be the best way. We also have a Boys and Girls Club that we're teaching kids, at least some of it too, and they pick it up very fast. Well, probably the easiest way, we have a couple places on the web. There's a couple dictionaries and things like that, but to actually hear it, there are some things on YouTube. You look up Ioway language. I have some things there myself. The Oto Missouri, which is a very linked dialect, has some things up there too. So I would say go to YouTube and start checking it out there. Some of them have. Our clans, we don't have, unlike some people, we don't have a common origin story. In all our stories, the earth was always here, and then the clans became who they were. And there's kind of a creation story for each clan that's particular to that clan, like the Bear people. We kind of came from under the earth. And then we met some of the other clans. Some came from the sky, some came over the water. So our story is primarily the earth's always been here, but different clans came from different places. And then we became a nation. And then that nation eventually split apart into the Ioway and Ho-Chunk and all these others. Yeah, so if you think about Domino Effect, back in the 1600s, there were big wars going on between the Iroquois and some of the nations back, tribal nations. And then of course, the English and the French were getting into it as well. Those were called the Beaver Wars over the fur trade, really. And some of the tribes back there began fleeing to the west. People like the Ojibwe, people like the Meskwaki, and all these folks were kind of moving to the west to get away from to survive. And that was happening in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And so the tribes who are bigger and the tribes who have access to guns tend to be the ones who dominate the others. And the Dakota to the north were getting pushed south by the Ojibwe Wars. They moved from Mille Lacs down into further south into Minnesota. The Sac and Fox, the Sauk and Meskwaki, were moving from Illinois and Wisconsin further into Iowa. They started fighting each other, the Sac and Fox and the Dakota. And Iowa, who were far fewer than them, we were starting to get pushed. We allied with one and the other over time, but then we began being more into Western Iowa and Southwestern Iowa. And so by the time of Lewis and Clark, we only kind of owned hunting grounds in Southern Iowa. And then we, through treaty, ceded those in the 1830s. I think, there's stories up there around Lake Pepin, for example, on the upper Mississippi. that there was a huge group of people in the 1400s, Dakotas, Ojibwe, Iowas, others, Algonquians, all kind of living together. Now you got to remember, people are kind of like neighbors, right? So sometimes you get along with your neighbors, and sometimes you have neighbor squabbles, and most of the time you can work those out, and sometimes you end up where you hate your neighbor, or they just move away or whatever. So it's just, you think about it on a bigger scale, right? So there was a time when we were a larger nation from about 1000 AD to about 1600s, and we all were related. We all kind of did a lot of ceremonies together. We all traded. Sometimes people squabbled and fought, but it was just pretty much fairly just living in alliance, and with occasional squabbles and spats. It wasn't really until the whole movement to the west that it got serious between people, because it was about survival at that point. Okay, thank you.